They mistook silence for weakness, and that mistake was the first crack in everything they believed about control. Silence has a way of being misunderstood. When someone doesn't speak up, doesn't fight back right away, doesn't look you in the eye, people rush to fill in the blanks. They assume fear. They assume submission. They assume victory is already theirs. Silence feels like permission to push further, to cross lines that should never be crossed. And that's exactly what happened here. She didn't argue. She didn't threaten. She didn't announce who she was or what she could do. She walked down the hallway without making noise, without drawing attention, without signaling danger. To them, that quiet was confirmation. It fed their confidence. It made them careless. They thought strength had a sound. They thought power always announced itself. They thought if someone had the upper hand, they would show it immediately. They were wrong. Silence is often a calculation. It's time bought, not time lost. While they whispered and laughed, her mind was working. While they waited, convinced the situation was frozen in their favor, she was mapping exits, counting steps, listening for movement, controlling her breathing. Silence gave her space to think while they wasted energy feeling superior. They filled the quiet with ego. She filled it with preparation. People who rely on intimidation depend on reaction. They need noise, panic, pleading. When they don't get it, they assume they've already won. That assumption dulls their awareness. It slows them down. It makes them sloppy. They stop watching as closely. They stop questioning their own safety. Silence disarms people like that because it refuses to play the role they've assigned. It doesn't beg. It doesn't explain. It doesn't give them feedback. They saw her isolation as vulnerability. Alone meant defenseless in their minds. No witnesses. No backup. No consequences. But being alone can also mean focus. It can mean no distractions, no one to protect but yourself. It can mean clarity. Silence wrapped around that space and sharpened it. Every sound mattered more. Every second stretched. And while they were convinced they were waiting her out, she was letting them reveal exactly how unprepared they were. Silence also hides experience. The most dangerous people rarely advertise what they know. Training teaches restraint before action. It teaches patience over impulse. It teaches that the first move doesn't have to be loud to be effective. Her silence wasn't fear freezing her in place. It was discipline holding her steady. The kind that keeps hands relaxed and eyes alert. The kind that waits for the right moment instead of rushing into the wrong one. They underestimated how silence can be intentional. They thought confidence was volume, laughter, numbers. They thought power was shown by taking up space. But real control often looks like stillness. It looks like someone who doesn't need to prove anything. Someone who lets others expose themselves. Someone who understands that reacting too early gives away leverage. In those 7 minutes, silence worked like a mirror. It reflected their arrogance back at them. They talked too much. They assumed too much. They believed the story they wanted to be true because it made them feel strong. And every word they spoke gave away more information. Where they were standing. How alert they were. What they expected to happen next. Silence let her collect all of it. There's a reason predators test boundaries quietly before they strike, and there's a reason professionals do the same. Silence blurs intention. It creates uncertainty, but only for the person who doesn't understand it. To someone trained, silence is a tool. It's cover. It's control disguised as absence. And when people mistake it for weakness, they lower their guard without realizing it. They believed the quiet meant she had nothing left. No options. No strength. No plan. They thought silence was surrender. They didn't realize it was restraint. They didn't realize it was confidence that didn't need witnesses. They didn't realize that by the time someone stops trying to convince you of their power, they're already deciding how much of it they need to use. The danger of assumptions is that they feel efficient. They let people decide quickly who someone is, what they're capable of, and how a situation will end. Assumptions save effort. They replace observation with shortcuts. And most of the time, they go unchallenged because they're built on patterns people think they understand. That confidence is exactly what makes them dangerous. They looked at her and filled in the story without asking a single question. Alone. Quiet. No resistance. Their minds jumped to conclusions that felt obvious to them. They assumed fear because fear was what they expected to see. They assumed weakness because it matched their narrative. They assumed control because they wanted it to be true. None of those assumptions were based on evidence. They were based on comfort. Assumptions flatten people. They erase complexity and replace it with stereotypes. When someone assumes they already know how another person will behave, they stop paying attention. They stop reading signals. They stop preparing for alternatives. They narrow their vision until only one outcome seems possible. That kind of thinking doesn't just miss details. It ignores risk. Every assumption they made reduced their caution. They assumed she wouldn't fight back, so they relaxed. They assumed she didn't know what to do, so they stopped watching her closely. They assumed the situation was already decided, so they treated it like a waiting game instead of a threat. Assumptions don't just shape expectations. They shape behavior. And behavior shaped by false confidence tends to be sloppy. They assume training looks obvious. That skill announces itself. That strength demands attention. But experience often teaches the opposite. The more someone knows, the less they feel the need to show it. The more capable someone is, the more measured they become. Assumptions blinded them to that possibility. They mistook calm for confusion, stillness for hesitation, silence for defeat. Assumptions also protect ego. Admitting uncertainty would mean admitting vulnerability. It would mean questioning whether they were actually in control. It would mean considering that they might be wrong. That kind of doubt feels threatening, so assumptions rush in to shut it down. They tell people what they want to hear. They create a false sense of safety that feels better than awareness. In those 7 minutes, assumptions stacked on top of each other. Each one reinforced the last. They assumed time was on their side. They assumed she was running out of options. They assumed nothing would change unless they decided to change it. What they didn't consider was that time can work both ways. That waiting doesn't always weaken the person being watched. Sometimes it exposes the people doing the watching. Assumptions also erase accountability. When people believe they already understand a situation, they stop questioning their own actions. They justify behavior because the story in their head makes it acceptable. If someone is assumed to be powerless, then taking advantage feels easier to excuse. If someone is assumed to be harmless, then being careless feels reasonable. Assumptions don't just misjudge others. They excuse poor decisions. They never asked who she was. They never considered why she wasn't reacting the way they expected. They never thought to question their own certainty. Assumptions kept them from noticing the small details that didn't fit their story. The steady breathing, the controlled posture, the lack of panic. Those details were warnings. But assumptions act like filters. They screen out anything that doesn't match the narrative. The danger of assumptions isn't just that they're wrong. It's that they feel right. They feel logical. They feel justified. And because they feel right, people act on them with confidence. That confidence can turn into cruelty. It can turn into recklessness. It can turn into traps built on shaky ground. Assumptions also remove adaptability. Once people decide how something will end, they stop preparing for other outcomes. They don't have backups. They don't have contingency plans. They don't have awareness. When reality shifts, they're caught off guard because they weren't watching for change. They were watching for confirmation. She didn't need them to underestimate her. They did it on their own. Their assumptions handed her time, information, and opportunity. They built a mental version of her that didn't exist, and then interacted with that version instead of the real person standing there. By the time doubt started to creep in, it was already too late to question the story they had been telling themselves. 7 minutes that changed everything didn't feel dramatic while they were happening. They felt slow, stretched, ordinary on the surface. Time didn't announce that it was about to matter. It just kept moving, second by second, while decisions were quietly forming. 7 minutes can pass without leaving a mark, or they can carve a line that divides before and after. What makes the difference is what happens inside that space. Waiting has a strange effect on people. Some grow impatient. Some grow careless. Some convince themselves that nothing will change if nothing has changed yet. Those 7 minutes gave them time to settle into certainty. Each passing moment reinforced their belief that they were in control. The longer nothing happened, the more convinced they became that nothing would. Time lulled them into comfort. For her, those same minutes were active. They were used, not endured. Every second was counted, not wasted. Time became a resource instead of a threat. While they leaned on assumptions, she leaned on awareness. The clock wasn't working against her. It was working for her. 7 minutes gave her space to observe without being observed, to listen without revealing intention. Small details become louder when time slows down. Footsteps in the distance. A shift in breathing. The rhythm of voices on the other side of a door. In those 7 minutes, information accumulated. Patterns emerged. Confidence turned into predictability. They began to move the same way, talk the same way, stand in the same places. Repetition creates openings, but only for someone patient enough to notice. Time also reveals mindset. Panic burns energy fast. Ego does too. Waiting exposed which one was driving them. Their jokes became louder. Their focus drifted. The edge dulled. Time didn't make them stronger. It softened them. It made them feel untouchable. That feeling is dangerous because it convinces people they don't need to stay sharp. 7 minutes also test discipline. Anyone can react in the first few seconds. Staying composed when nothing happens requires control. It requires trust in training, in instinct, in preparation done long before the moment arrived. Stillness isn't passive when it's chosen. It's effort. It's restraint. It's the ability to let time pass without giving yourself away. Those minutes created contrast. On one side, impatience disguised as confidence. On the other, calm disguised as vulnerability. They saw the waiting as pressure. She saw it as confirmation. Every second without escalation told her exactly how they thought, how they planned, how they underestimated the situation. Time gave her clarity while it gave them false security. 7 minutes also narrowed the margin for error. The longer they waited, the more invested they became in their version of the outcome. Changing course would have meant admitting doubt. Admitting doubt would have meant losing face. Time locked them into their choices. It made backing down harder. It made reassessment uncomfortable. That rigidity worked against them. Moments like these don't announce themselves as turning points. There's no signal that says this is the window, this is the shift. It's only visible in hindsight. In real time, it feels like nothing is happening. But beneath the surface, momentum is changing direction. Pressure is transferring. Advantage is moving. 7 minutes can also strip away noise. When there's nothing new to react to, people reveal who they are. Masks slip. Habits surface. Overconfidence shows itself in small, careless acts. A missed glance. A turn back. A laugh at the wrong moment. Those details are easy to miss if you're rushed. Time made them visible. For her, those minutes were about alignment. Aligning breath with thought. Thought with movement. Movement with intent. Nothing rushed. Nothing forced. Time allowed her to sink herself fully with the situation. By the time the waiting ended, the outcome was already forming. They believed the power was in what would happen next. They didn't realize the shift had already occurred. The balance didn't change when someone moved. It changed while everyone was still. 7 minutes passed, but only one side understood what those minutes had delivered. Training shows when fear appears, not when everything is calm and predictable. Anyone can look confident when there's no pressure, when the outcome feels safe, when control seems guaranteed. Fear is the real test. It strips away performance and exposes habits. It reveals whether someone reacts on impulse or responds with intention. In moments like these, training doesn't make someone fearless. It teaches them what to do while fear is present. Fear changes the body before the mind catches up. Breathing shortens. Muscles tighten. Vision narrows. Thoughts speed up or freeze entirely. Without training, fear takes control and drives behavior. People rush. They overreact. They make noise. They give themselves away. Training doesn't erase those physical reactions, but it gives structure around them. It creates a framework that keeps fear from turning into chaos. Her fear didn't disappear. It was managed. It was contained. Training taught her to acknowledge it without letting it dictate her actions. Slow the breath. Lower the shoulders. Stay aware of surroundings. These aren't dramatic moves. They're subtle. They're internal. That's why they're easy to miss from the outside. To someone watching, she looked still. Inside, systems were being activated. Training also replaces hesitation with priorities. When fear hits, Untrained minds ask too many questions at once. What if this goes wrong? What if I make it worse? What if I'm not fast enough? Training narrows those questions into action steps. What's the nearest exit? Where's the threat? What do I control right now? That focus is what keeps movement deliberate instead of frantic. When fear appears, instinct tries to take over. Instinct can be useful, but it's unreliable under stress. Training refines instinct. It turns raw reaction into practiced response. Repetition builds pathways that don't require conscious thought. That's why trained people can move with calm in situations that would overwhelm others. They're not improvising. They're executing what's already been rehearsed. Training also teaches patience under threat. Fear pushes people to act too soon. It creates a sense of urgency that feels unbearable. But action at the wrong time can be more dangerous than waiting. Training teaches that timing matters. It teaches that sometimes the smartest move is to hold position, to gather more information, to let the situation unfold a little longer before committing. Her training taught her to read the room, even while fear was present. Body language, tone of voice, distance. Those details don't disappear when adrenaline rises. They become more important. Training trains attention as much as action. It keeps awareness wide when fear tries to narrow it. There's also a difference between fear and panic. Panic is fear without direction. Training gives fear direction. It channels energy into control rather than release. That's why trained individuals often look calm. They're not calmer. They're more focused. Fear sharpens instead of scatters because it's been integrated into preparation. Fear also exposes gaps. Training reveals them early. It teaches people to recognize when something feels off and to trust that signal. Without training, fear is ignored or denied. With training, it's treated as information. That awareness can prevent mistakes before they happen. In those moments, training showed in what she didn't do. She didn't rush. She didn't plead. She didn't telegraph her intentions. She didn't waste energy on unnecessary movement. Restraint is a trained skill. It goes against natural impulse. It requires confidence built over time, not in the moment. Training doesn't guarantee safety. It doesn't promise control over others. It only guarantees control over self. And that control is often the deciding factor. When fear appears, the difference between chaos and clarity is preparation. Between reaction and response. Between being overwhelmed and being ready. They believed fear would weaken her. They expected it to break her composure, to force mistakes, to expose vulnerability. What they didn't understand was that fear was the environment her training was designed for. It wasn't an obstacle. It was the condition under which everything she knew became relevant. Power isn't always visible, and that's what makes it easy to underestimate. People are taught to look for obvious signs. Volume, size, numbers, aggression, confidence that spills into the room and demands attention. When those signals are missing, power is often assumed to be absent. Quiet is mistaken for lack. Restraint is mistaken for uncertainty. Stillness is mistaken for fear. Visible power is loud because it needs confirmation. It wants to be recognized, respected, or feared. It announces itself early to shape the situation before it has to prove anything. Invisible power doesn't need that. It doesn't rush to establish dominance. It doesn't rely on intimidation or spectacle. It operates without permission and without warning. They scanned the situation for the kind of power they understood. Someone pushing back. Someone raising their voice. Someone trying to take control. When none of that appeared, they relaxed. Their definition of power was too narrow. They believed if it was real, they would see it immediately. They didn't consider that the most dangerous advantage is the one you don't notice until it's already in motion. Invisible power often looks like patience. Like someone who doesn't feel the need to rush or explain. Like someone who lets others reveal themselves first. That kind of power is internal. It comes from preparation, not performance. From knowing exactly what you can do without needing to prove it to anyone else. Power that stays hidden has freedom. It isn't tied to expectation. It isn't forced to act a certain way to maintain an image. Because it's unseen, it can move without resistance. People don't guard against what they don't believe exists. They don't plan for what they can't imagine. That's what made the situation tilt without anyone realizing when it happened. She didn't look powerful by their standards. She didn't match the image they were prepared to deal with. That mismatch worked in her favor. It allowed her to exist outside their threat assessment. They weren't watching her closely because they didn't think she mattered. They weren't cautious because they didn't think caution was necessary. Invisible power also carries less ego. Ego needs validation. It needs reaction. It needs an audience. Real capability doesn't. It's comfortable being underestimated because it knows the difference between appearance and outcome. That comfort creates calm. Calm creates clarity. And clarity creates options. There's a reason professionals are trained to blend in rather than stand out. Visibility attracts attention. Attention invites interference. Power that wants to last learns how to disappear until it's needed. That doesn't make it weaker. It makes it precise. They mistook her lack of reaction for lack of ability. They thought if she had power, she would use it immediately. They didn't understand that restraint can be a form of dominance. Choosing when not to act is often harder than acting. It requires confidence and timing. It requires trust and skill. Invisible power also changes the direction of control. When someone assumes they're the strongest person in the room, they stop protecting themselves. They expose angles they wouldn't otherwise. They turn their backs. They speak freely. They move predictably. Power that isn't announced feeds on that predictability. She didn't need to intimidate them. Their own certainty did the work. Their belief that they understood the situation removed their defenses. They thought they were managing her. In reality, they were revealing themselves. Every assumption they made cleared the path a little more. Power isn't always about force. Sometimes it's about positioning, about awareness, about the ability to stay composed while others drift into carelessness. That kind of power doesn't show up in posture or tone. It shows up in outcomes. They were watching for resistance. They weren't watching for readiness. They were listening for panic. They weren't listening for control. They believed strength had to look a certain way because that belief made the world easier to navigate. Questioning it would have meant admitting vulnerability. Invisible power thrives in that gap. It exists where certainty replaces caution, where confidence replaces curiosity, where people stop asking what they might be missing. It waits there, unnoticed, until the moment visibility no longer matters. When power finally reveals itself, it often looks sudden, unexpected, disproportionate. People call it surprising because they weren't paying attention to the signs that didn't fit their expectations. The truth is it was there the entire time, operating quietly, patiently, without needing acknowledgement when the trap turns around. It rarely happens in a single dramatic moment. It happens gradually, almost invisibly, while everyone involved still believes the original plan is intact. A trap depends on certainty, on the belief that roles are fixed, that one side is hunting and the other is caught. The moment that belief becomes inaccurate, the trap begins to fail, even if no one realizes it yet. They thought they were setting the conditions, choosing the place, controlling the timing, deciding when pressure would be applied. From their perspective, everything was unfolding exactly as intended. Waiting wasn't a risk. It was part of the plan. But traps are fragile when they rely too much on expectation and not enough on awareness. The shift began when they stopped adapting. A real trap requires constant adjustment. It requires attention to changes, no matter how small. They assumed nothing was changing because nothing obvious was happening. That assumption froze them in place. Their plan became static while the situation remained dynamic. A trap also assumes the person inside it has fewer options than the people outside. That belief shapes behavior. It creates confidence that borders on carelessness. Movements become repetitive. Positions stop changing. Focus narrows. What starts as control slowly becomes predictability. She didn't need to break the trap. She only needed to let it reveal its weaknesses. Every plan leaves gaps when it's built on arrogance. Every setup creates blind spots when the planners believe they've already won. The longer they waited, the more obvious those gaps became. They were watching for escape. They weren't watching for reversal. Their attention was pointed in one direction. They were prepared to react to panic, to pleading, to sudden movement. They weren't prepared for calm. They weren't prepared for someone using their own structure against them. When a trap turns around, Control changes hands quietly. It moves from the people who think they're managing the situation to the person who understands it better. That transfer doesn't require force at first. It requires patience. It requires letting the other side continue believing their assumptions. They gave away information without realizing it. Where they stood, how they positioned themselves, how alert they really were, who was leading and who was following. Traps rely on secrecy, but they talked. They joked. They filled the silence with confidence. And every sound narrowed their margin. A trap also depends on fear doing the work. Fear is supposed to weaken the person inside. It's supposed to rush decisions, cause mistakes, shorten attention. When fear doesn't behave as expected, the trap loses its advantage. Calm disrupts the entire structure. It introduces uncertainty where certainty was required. They believed time was on their side. That belief is dangerous. Time exposes habits. It magnifies overconfidence. It erodes discipline. The longer they waited, the more invested they became in the idea that nothing could go wrong. That investment made them rigid. And rigidity is a weakness. When the trap began to turn, they didn't feel it. There was no signal, no sudden threat, just a subtle imbalance. The situation no longer favored them as much as they thought, but they were too comfortable to notice. Comfort dulls awareness. It convinces people that vigilance is unnecessary. A turning trap often feels unfair to the people who set it. They believe rules have been broken, that the outcome doesn't match the effort they put in. What they miss is that effort doesn't equal control. Understanding does. And understanding doesn't always announce itself. She didn't disrupt the plan. She let it collapse under its own weight. Their confidence carried them forward while their caution lagged behind. They were still operating under old assumptions while the reality of the situation had already shifted. By the time movement mattered, the roles were no longer what they believed them to be. The hunter was reacting. The hunted was deciding. The structure they built to contain someone had become something they were trapped inside of themselves. When a trap turns around, it's rarely because of a single bold move. It's because one side stopped questioning and the other never did.